right, thank you. So as Steve mentioned, my name is Sonia Keith, and I work for the Natural Resources Conservation Service. I'm an assistant state conservationist for partnerships with NRCS, and I have to tell you, Steve, I try to, when talking to people like this, I try to always briefly mention all the layers of ag people in the state, and I try to talk about the local and the state levels, and you have done that marvelously, and I don't have to do that this time around, and I don't do it justice because I'm trying to quickly get to the federal side of things, but I guess the overall point is that there is a massive ag community. The numbers from NAS were great to see, but also just letting people know those resources at each level for those people is great. And the vast majority of the ag-related partners that you mentioned, as a partnership person for NRCS, I spend a whole lot of time working with them. So, for example, Alan Bryant with the Soil and Water Conservation Districts, I work with him on a regular basis, and Paulette with the Division of Conservation. Amanda, I see her at a lot of meetings with Ag Council and Soil and Water Conservation Commission meetings, that sort of thing. I'm around the Kentucky Farm Bureau all the time, so it's really a large network, and I appreciate you touching on that. So what Steve asked me to do is just talk a little bit about the Natural Resources Conservation Service and kind of put a water quality spin on it, since we are talking to watershed coordinators across the state. Just a little background about me. I am the partnership coordinator now. I've been doing that for about 1.5 years, but in my previous life, I was a watershed engineer. So I did a lot of work across the state with our emergency watershed protection program, which I'll briefly touch on. Also work very closely with watershed conservancy districts and some of the watershed dams that we have across the state. So it did my heart good to hear that piece as well. Steve. So let's see if I can. All right. So who is the Natural Resources Conservation Service? Steve covered this pretty well already, but we are a sub-agency of the U.S. Department of Ag. We've been around for a long time. We're relatively small when you think about federal, but we were established in 1935 as the Soil Erosion Service. We kind of got our birth, quote unquote, out of the Dust Bowl that happened in the 30s. One of the largest man-made disasters of all time. Kind of let people realize that we needed to try to look at soil and try to treat it a little bit better. So that's kind of where we started. They changed our name a couple of times. We were the Soil Conservation Service for a very long time. And then in 1994, they thought, you know what, we need to be looking at broader natural resource concerns. So they changed our name to the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So if you've been around for a while and you see some maybe old things that might be in some of our offices, a lot of them say Soil Conservation Service, and that's us, just a younger us, or an older us, I should say. I do want to reiterate that we are not a regulatory agency. That is a common misconception. We are a federal agency. We do look at environmental concerns, but we only come out to work with landowners or entities if they request us to do so. It's a voluntary thing. So we have kind of two arms, so to speak. We have a technical assistance side of our agency, and we have the financial assistance side of our agency. And NRCS in general was funded and founded to be a very technical kind of an agency. So if you are working with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, you're going to have access to engineers, agronomists, soil scientists. We have biologists, we have archaeologists. So there's a lot of biologists on our staff. The people that are out working one-on-one with the farmers are mostly certified conservation planners. So there's a lot of technical stuff that NRCS brings to the table. And then we do have that financial assistance component, which is the programs I'll briefly talk about, where we do give some cost share assistance to implement what we call conservation practices on the ground. That's our terminology for it. It's very similar to a best management practice, or a BMP. So just very simply, in our CS, our whole motto is to help people help the land. So from a technical aspect or a financial aspect. That technical assistance piece, what happens is if you have a farmer who, let's just, keeping it in the water quality vein, is having some issues or concerns with water quality problems on their farm, they can contact our local service centers. We have, the way we're kind of set up is we have a service center for every, on average, 4 or 5 counties. We have staff in most counties, and they can contact those local offices directly, that landowner can and ask for some technical assistance. What NRCS will do is we go out and work with those landowners, and we develop what we call a conservation plan. So it's basically just looking at their property, looking at their ag operation, identifying some issues, talking to that landowner to see what they think their issues are, and then also bringing our technical expertise to the table to say, well, you're having this problem, but it's probably because of this sort of thing. So we do what's called a conservation plan, where we identify these problem areas, talk about different things that they can do to address those. As I mentioned before, we have engineering design assistance. Most of our conservation practices they're either engineering in nature or they're agronomic in nature. And then we will kind of bring the people to the table that needs to be there, depending on what we see needs to happen. We also, I'll talk briefly about this, and I mentioned it just a minute ago. We do have a couple of watershed-wide kind of efforts that we do. I mentioned that I worked as a watershed engineer for years and worked with those watershed conservancy districts. We also have a couple of programs that I'll talk about that is not actually directly one-on-one with a farmer or a landowner, but is to help like cities and counties with damage related to natural disasters. Kentucky, that's mostly flooding. Or flooding issue, long-term flooding issues, or water quality issues on that watershed scale. Those are a little bit different programs that I'll touch on briefly. The financial assistance side of things is, once we do that conservation plan and we identify some fixes, then our staff, the NRCS staff, will say, based on what I see here and the issues that you're having, I think you should probably apply for whatever program. And when you do that, they will help walk you through that application process. And that's that financial assistance that, for the most part, on these farm bill related programs, is direct assistance provided to those farmers or landowners to implement those conservation practices to try to alleviate some of those natural resource concerns. Again, those kind of bigger programs that are more watershed wide, on those particular ones, we are going to be giving financial assistance to like a city or a county entity or a special district, something like that. We will give that. It's a cost share type of a program. Usually when we're doing financial assistance, about 75% to 90% of that cost will be covered. And NRCS is involved in that process as well. We want to make sure that whatever we do meets our design specifications. So, for example, if you're installing an engineering practice like a waste management system, for example, we're going to have people out there making sure it's installed correctly and done according to our specifications. Steve also mentioned easements and the PACE program. We also have an easement component that we can do. Typically, the most popular one that we have is restoring wetlands to their original kind of hydrology conditions. But that's another kind of thing that we do. That's a cost share financial assistance program I'll touch on briefly. So again, voluntary. We're not going to be coming out to anybody's farm and saying you're causing a water quality issue, you're in trouble, you need to do something. That's not our role. But as a watershed coordinator, if you are talking to someone who has concerns, to us. As I mentioned earlier, we partner with all of those different entities that Steve mentioned. And in fact, on here, we work locally day in and day out with conservation districts. In fact, across the state, you will find that a lot of our NRCS offices are co-located with those conservation districts. And I know the Farm Service Agency will be speaking next. It's the same kind of thing. A lot of those FSA and NRCS and district offices are co-located together. So we do a lot of work trying to balance out that federal piece, that local piece, that state piece, and then also working with other federal entities like FSA. So briefly, a couple of our programs that are most popular across Kentucky. The first one is the Environmental Quality Incentive Programs. We call that EQIP for short. And again, you're gonna have a landowner that asks for assistance. We're gonna go out and do that technical evaluation, do that conservation plan first. If EQIP seems like a good fit, the NRCS staff will kind of help that person go through that, and then we will, if EQIP, we'll talk them through the program specifics, how it works. And basically that EQIP program and our other programs as well, that's what's going to put those practices on the ground. So if you have a crop field that has a ton of erosion that's causing water quality issues, our staff would identify that you probably need a grass waterway, let's just say, for example, and that EQIP would be a good way to get some funding to put that on the ground. Another kind of popular program that we have is our Conservation Stewardship program. It's a little bit different. I kind of explain it to people as almost like a reward program. The people who are going to do really well in this are people who are already kind of environmentally conscious, already doing, implementing BMPs or conservation practices. They're already, trying to be good stewards of the land, and they may want to just do a little bit more, take it a little bit further. Get some credit for the work that they have been doing, and that's where Conservation Stewardship program kind of comes in. So we do a lot of CSP with forest and woodland owners in the eastern part of the state, interestingly enough. But that's another program that our field staff can talk to landowners about directly. Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, we call it ACEP, and that's what I mentioned earlier. Again, voluntary. But, a lot of our wetlands were drained, historically drained to crop. And, sometimes, people just realize that that land is wet and it's maybe not great to crop, and it's going to keep flooding repetitively. A lot of these are on river bottoms. So, we do this easement program where we can go in. If it qualifies, we can restore those wetlands. So as you probably can imagine, we have a lot of this out in the western part of the state along that Mississippi River, but also all along the Ohio River as well. We have other easement programs too. We have a FPE, actually can't remember my own acronym, flood protection easement maybe, where we've actually done some buyouts of properties, homeowner properties, not ag people, but just properties that are in the floodplain and they repetitively flood. So, we can do it like a buyout. We put an easement on that property so nobody ever builds a house there again. We did quite some of that in the eastern part of the state too long ago. So there's different kind of easement programs that we can do. The wetland one is by far the most probably a popular one, the one that we have the most people sign up for. So that's just a brief introduction into some of the easement stuff. Again, all of our field staff that are out working in these counties, they are versed in all of these, and they can kind of steer people toward which one makes the most sense for what they have needs for, and then they bring in those technical or program people as needed to kind of flesh it out. Common practices that we do in the state. I want to just try to go through a couple of those so you kind of had an idea of what we are actually implementing on the ground with a lot of these farmers. And I try to keep it kind of in a water quality vein. But, one thing is kind of simple. We do a lot of cover crops. You know, if you have a farmer who's cropping his land and they just leave it open, bare ground, you know, tons of erosion. It's also very bad for the soil, and over time will impact that producer's yields. So we will go in and pay on a per acre basis to put a cover crop in that, and we do that in conjunction with what their main crop is going to be. So they can kind of rotate through that, and it helps water quality. It also helps that farmer in the long run because he's going to be getting more yield and have a better, healthy soil to do his cropping. We have some precision pesticide applications, things that we can do. You know, helping farmers understand the soil types that they have. I mentioned we have soil scientists on our staff. You know, what's growing in your soil, what works good, what kind of pesticide should you put in, and how much should you put, and where should you put it. Really kind of helps, obviously, with water quality, because you don't have a bunch of extra pesticides running off into the streams. But the farmers tend to like it because it reduces their input costs. So if they're not putting more on than they need to, then that reduces their costs. So we try to, you know, our more popular practices you'll see kind of helps that farmer from the economic standpoint of, you know, having a viable business and making a living, and also it provides that environmental benefit as well. We do a lot of rotational fencing and grazing kind of things, just where we will go out and we look at the herd size of some of these beef operations, is the most common one. And we try to divide those paddocks up, you know, keeping good vegetation on the ground. So the farmer is not feeding as much hay or extra stuff. They can use more of what just grows naturally. So farmers like that from an economical standpoint. We like it from a natural resource standpoint because, again, it's reducing the soil compaction. It's keeping good vegetation stands on that. So we do a lot of that sort of work. Heavy use areas, you know, if you're driving along the highway and you see where a farmer is feeding his livestock, or you can very clearly see those trails that they walk to the barn and back, and it's just a big muddy, mucky mess. We do a lot of heavy use areas where we do some geotextile and some gravel overlay to help with erosion, helps with soil compaction, that sort of thing. So we do a lot of HUAs. We do them a lot around like watering tanks and that sort of thing, where the animals tend to congregate as well. Very common practice. Also, we do a lot of livestock facility watering tanks and pipelines. I think I have a slide coming up that says that we do a whole lot of fencing. So one of the things that we always try to promote is fencing livestock out of waterways, out of streams. But you know, if you're a farmer and we say when you need to fence all these cows out, then the very next question is, how do I get water to them? So these are kind of companion practices. We do a lot of fencing, and then we will install those pipeline and tanks to get water to those animals. Also, when we're setting up rotational grazing, you know, that's the other thing. If I'm going to rotate my animals throughout all these different paddocks, I need to have water in all those paddocks. So we try to put these systems where part of them, you know, this particular picture is a 4-hole waterer. So 2 holes are on one side of the fence and 2 holes are on the other side of the fence, so they can have that watering capability for their livestock. Prescribed grazing, I kind of touched on that, but you know, we can go a little more in depth and talk about what needs to be, you know, how many animals you have, what size paddocks you should use, what you should be trying to plant there for those animals, what works best with the soil type that you have. That's the kind of stuff that we look at for prescribed grazing. Maybe I don't have fences. Maybe I just went by it. Yeah. So we do, fencing is actually probably our number one a practice that we install across the state. So landscape-wide, watershed-wide planning. I mentioned earlier, I was going to touch on that briefly. I just want to let you all know, especially as watershed coordinators, that this is something that the Natural Resources Conservation Service offers. We're not as well known for these as we are with just the regular farm bill programs that I just went over. But we have the Emergency Watershed Protection Program. The best way to really explain that is it's very similar to FEMA. So there has to be a natural disaster that's caused a watershed impairment. We are much, much, much smaller than FEMA. And we're typically going to be only doing cleanup work in like a creek or a waterway that's causing an erosion issue or threatening some kind of infrastructure. So that's kind of the scale of that. It's much smaller than what FEMA does, but if we're responding to a natural disaster and FEMA, a presidential disaster has been declared and FEMA's there, it's often confusing for the local watershed coordinators and county judge executives to understand what's EWP and what's FEMA. But that is something that we can do across the state. And then we have Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program. So Steve mentioned earlier about those watershed conservancy districts. Most of them are overseeing watershed dams that NRCS built back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. In fact, a lot of people don't realize this. NRCS has built over 11,000 dams across the United States. 200 of those are in Kentucky. And the Watershed Conservancy District map that Steve put up actually correlates to where our watershed dams are. Those are owned and operated by those districts. But we provided technical assistance and often financial assistance to build those dams. So those were all installed under this Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program. So nowadays, it's really difficult to build a dam because there's a lot of environmental impacts to that. But we can still look at communities that are having water quality issues and flooding issues, and if it can be tied pretty clearly to an ag issue, we could pursue funding in this under this program. It's a very long, drawn-out process. It takes years to do, but that is something that we do offer. There does have to be, I think, it's like 20% ag or 20% benefit to ag for USDA to get involved with that. Watershed Rehabilitation, that's specific to those 200 dams that I mentioned that we've designed and built across the state, aging infrastructure issues. So we do have a rehabilitation program specific to those dams. They have to be dams that NRCS helped with, but we do have some rehab funding available to help those watershed conservancy districts with some of those issues. And then the watershed surveys and planning, that kind of is a planning part to feed these other watershed programs, making sure that they meet the requirements of the program and to move forward with those. So just to reiterate really quickly, I hope I'm not throwing too much at you all, but we are voluntary, but we do have rules. I mentioned that if we're going to be providing financial assistance for some of these practices, they have to be designed and installed to our specifications. We want to make sure that the taxpayer money is going toward projects and implementation that are going to withstand the test of time. These programs are competitive. So I will say that under almost every program we have, actually I think I can say every program we have, we always have way more applicants than we have funding. So it is a competitive process. It's not guaranteed. Technical assistance we can provide. That's part of what we do anyway, and we can give farmers and landowners technical assistance and advice, but that financial assistance piece is competitive. I will say that for those farm bill programs, EQIP, CSP, easements, there is a continuous application sign up. So if you refer a landowner to our field office, they can apply at any time, no matter what. We do have cutoff periods where we kind of batch those applications up and do some ranking and figure out which ones are going to be funded, but you can fund it or go in and apply at any time. One of the things that we also do, I mentioned earlier, in the eastern part of the state, we have forest stand improvement. So a lot of people don't associate forest land as an ag kind of a of land, but it does qualify. So we do a lot of forest stand improvement in the eastern part of the state, where we're going in and kind of cleaning up the understory, taking out some undesirable trees, that sort of thing. That is a cost share program that we do. That helps water quality. It helps the landowners have, more productive forest, that sort of thing. So I wanted to make sure I mentioned that as well. So this, I want to touch briefly on this. This is steps to assistance. I mentioned it throughout my presentation, but basically we have that planning side of things. That's that technical assistance where we do that conservation plan. Then we do the application process, where our staff will tell you kind of where to go, what programs to apply for, that sort of thing. We'll work with you for eligibility. And a lot of that includes the Farm Service Agency, which will be speaking next. You have to have a farm service number, that sort of thing. Our people will walk you through all that. They will rank applications. So, and if you get funded, then we will help with that implementation part of it, which is where you actually are putting those practices on the ground. And this is the part that I was missing in the other one. So I wanted just to tell you all financial assistance dollar-wise, kind of what we do in the state. So this is for FY19. So last year, our fiscal years run October through September. So in that easement program, the agriculture easement program, that we did about almost $10 million in the state, and that's actual implementation dollars on the ground. That's not that technical part where we're going out and helping. That's actual money to a landowner to implement practices. So about $10 million in the ASEP program. Conservation stewardship was about $5.5 million. And then the EQIP environmental quality incentives program, a little over $17 million. So just in those three programs alone, you can see, we're over $30 million in 1 year of getting conservation assistance directly to landowners. So I just wanted to give the scale of that for everybody. And this is a map that kind of shows for those same three programs. I just pull those out because those are the ones that are our most popular ones. That kind of shows where it's divided out. So again, Steve, good job on the NASS data. So if you see that, Logan County is a big ag producer. The red counties are the ones where we have more money that has been implemented in these practices. We have a few little gray ones, where we don't have any dollars, but for the most part, we're getting conservation on the ground in every county in the state. And I did want to say, last year, I mentioned that fence was one of our most popular practices that we do. So we actually installed last year in FY19 1.3 million feet of fence. So I always like to do this just to give people perspective. That's about 245 miles of fence that we installed across the state in 1 year. It's basically if you went from Covington, Kentucky, down I-75 all the way to Knoxville, Tennessee. So we would have fenced one side of I-75 for that length. I mean, it's a lot of fence that we're doing. And I mentioned that we do a lot of pipelines with that fence. So we installed almost 400,000 feet of pipeline last year. So that equates to about 73 miles of pipeline. So that would be basically from Louisville to Lexington if you ran a pipeline right on the interstate there. So I just wanted to let you all kind of get an idea of, not only what these programs are and what they do, but kind of the impact that they have across the state on an annual basis. And this is the website that I mentioned, and you couldn't see my screen. I'm sorry about that. But anytime you're working with a landowner as a watershed coordinator, or and you want to send them our way, the best way to do that is to contact that local service center. So we're a federal agency, but we kind of try to have what I call a local feel. So we try to have people, we have service centers across the state. We try to have people in most of our counties that can work directly with those landowners. So this is the website address. It brings up a map. You can click on the county that you're in, and it will bring up the address of the office and the names of the people in the office and phone numbers to get them to If you want, you can always send them like to me, for example, but I will do the same thing. If I get a phone call from someone in Logan County wanting some kind of assistance, I'm going to direct them to that field office in Logan County, because it's just more hands-on local kind of assistance that we try to achieve. And that's our Kentucky NRCS webpage that has information on all the programs that I talked about. And we'll also have information on some other programs that I didn't go into very much.